My name is Dave Trinklein. I am adjunct associate professor in plant sciences, state extension specialist, as well as the master gardener coordinator, and have spent quite a bit of my extension time helping greenhouse, high tunnel, and other kind of growers with both vegetable as well as ornamental plants. First of all, I think it's important to control any insect. We need to know something about its biology. And by that, I mean its reproductive habits and its feeding habits. Aphids in the greenhouse are females that in turn give rise to live females without mating. That process is called parthenogenesis. So this is why you see aphid populations explode almost overnight, because one female aphid can give rise to as many as a dozen young in one day. And it doesn't take too long for those immature females to gain enough maturity to in turn give rise to, again, live females. This happens in the greenhouse or outdoors during summer conditions. During winter conditions, aphids change to egg laying, and it's by eggs that they overwinter outdoors. So indoors, we have a problem in that we have females giving rise to additional females. Now, aphids have very soft exoskeletons. Insects have exoskeletons, while mammals have internal skeletons. And the aphid's exoskeleton is quite soft and prone to drying. This is why outdoors, especially during the heat of a typical Missouri summer, aphids usually aren't that much of a problem, except on maybe a few crops. Frankly, it's just too hot, too windy, and too dry for them to survive. Additionally, it's important to know the feeding habit of the insects we're trying to control. And aphids have piercing and sucking mouth parts, meaning they have a proboscis or feeding apparatus that pierces through the epidermis and gets into the mesophyll cells and starts feeding on cell sap. They're extremely proficient at doing that. So relative to their control, once we have an established population, then we have a real battle on our hands. I would first of all suggest, and of course this is kind of like with the horses already out of the barn, so to speak, but in future high tunnel crops, to try to clean the greenhouse or high tunnel as thoroughly as possible between crops. That will hopefully reduce the population. If the high tunnel is not used over the summer, most of them are, but if it's not, then fallowing the high tunnel, rolling down the sides and letting it get really hot during the summer would be a good way to once again reduce the adult population. So at least we're getting a fresh start, or as fresh as we can with regard to the aphid population. So if you will, prevention would be my first step in future crops to try to combat aphids. We're dealing with, though, established populations, and what I assume, if the person is reporting this already, would be a cool season crop. Something like the lettuces, spinach, the cole crops, or so forth. And that cool, humid environment of the winter high tunnel is absolutely perfect for aphids to survive because of their soft body. So this means that we're going to have to deal with them in some way to knock down that population. I'll give you a few chemicals that can be tried. Because of their rapid reproductive time, aphids do tend to develop resistances just about as quickly as any insect will develop them. But there are a few insecticides that are aimed at controlling insects with piercing and sucking mouth parts. And what we need to find is something that is labeled for vegetables, assuming the person in question is growing vegetables in a high tunnel. The first one that comes to mind, which has been on the market for quite a while, but still can be effective, is imidacloprid, sold under various brand names, an example being Admire Pro. This can be put down in the soil and taken up by the plant if it's done early enough. If you apply it to the soil, it has a 21-day pre-harvest interval, which if the person in question here is already harvesting lettuce or so forth, we can't do that. When applied as a foliar spray, imidacloprid, again, example Admire Pro, has a 0-day pre-harvest interval. So that means you can literally spray one day and I would wait, but harvest the next. So that's one example. And that happens to be imidacloprid, one of the neonicotinoids. So anything else with that same IRAC number, Insect Resistance Action Committee, IRAC number, and I think it's 4A, you would not be rotating, which is important. A relatively new one that does involve a different mode of action is called Spirotetramat, sold under the brand name exclusively. It's still under patent of Movento. That has a different mode of action. It's in the IRAC category number 23. So it too has I think it's a 1-day pre-harvest interval, post-spray pre-harvest. So it's something that as a foliar spray, you can put on one day and harvest the next. Of course, with that saying, we take for granted that good, thorough coverage is important. And when you're dealing with the lettuces and cabbages and things like that, this becomes somewhat of a problem because of the heavy floppy growth. There is one more that could be explored in one of two ways. Azadirachtin is derived from the neem seed. It's not neem oil, but it is derived from the neem seed, which makes it very close to neem oil. Azatin or Azagard are two brand names which you might look for. Those who want to practice or who might be organic certified, MPED, capital M-PEDE, is essentially the new name for insecticidal soap. And it acts by essentially cracking the exoskeleton. Entomologist one told me you can look upon MPED as giving aphids the worst case of dishpan hands you've ever seen. Unfortunately, that's more true during hot weather than during cool weather. So it might give them dishpan hands and cause them to crack, but not to dry out as effectively as during hotter weather. Neem oil is organic certified or MRI approved, and that too does carry the label for aphid control. If we're looking for biologicals, I think the most effective I've seen are members of the genus Aphidius, I think it's pronounced. This is a little wasp-like insect that parasitizes the aphid by laying its eggs in the aphid itself. And very soon you will see kind of a whitish looking mummified aphid, which is not going to do any more harm. Unfortunately, they don't fall off when they die. And if you're picking lettuce that has mummified aphids on it, you're going to have to wash them off, or people are not going to accept that. But that is one of the few biological agents that I have seen to be effective. Ladybird beetles, lacewing, so forth, they give very erratic control. And I've heard of cases where on the first warm day, when people might crack the sides of their high tunnel and they had ladybird beetles in, the ladybird beetles all decided life is better outside and they left. So it is a formidable opponent. Again, trying to start with a clean slate for your next crop would be certainly the way I would begin, and then careful monitoring and applying pesticides as you deem appropriate, depending upon your growing regimen. And by that, I mean organic or non-organic, and going from there. You'll notice I didn't mention any of the synthetic pyrethroids. They really seem to have lost their effectiveness. They are labeled for vegetables. some of them, and for aphid control, but frankly speaking, they're not that effective. And this is why people are shying away from using them and going to some of these newer compounds with rather novel modes of action.
One question about the parasitic wasps, the
Yes.
biologicals, so they will survive in the high tunnel in the winter?
Well, it's a very good question you ask. If you clean the plant from debris and start in spring with, as I advocated, a fresh start, you're going to have cleaned out all of your beneficial wasps as well. So you have to reintroduce them. They are not terribly expensive, but very honestly, biological control usually is more expensive than chemical control. What we run into problems is that in certain cases, the biological organism has a longer reproductive time than the pest we're trying to control. And such is the case with aphid and this little wasp in cool temperatures, which simply means that you have to release more of them to get the job done. During the summer, they might build up populations as fast as, if not faster, than the pest. But since they respond to temperature like all insects do in the reproductive time, they're going to be a bit slow in the late winter, early spring greenhouse, more so than in the summer greenhouse.
And then I'll just ask you one other question. You mentioned
Sure.
how important it was to do a deep cleaning between crops. And sometimes that's hard with high tunnels because
Very
our
hard.
producers want to grow something,
Right. And
almost all the time.
Sure.
So could you just mention again some good ways to start with a fresh slate?
Well, even if we follow, let's say, tomatoes, which we plant in the spring and fruit through the summer, and then take out and put in some kind of a cool season crop in the fall, between crops, first of all, clean out all of the debris of the previous crop. And I mean more than just the plants, rake up the leaves, every little speck of plant material that you can get out would be good preventative maintenance. If you have the luxury of time, fallowing the high tunnel, and this is especially effective during the fall when the temperature is still fairly warm, for 2 weeks. Anything is better than nothing, but fallowing it, and by that we mean nothing in there. You've cleaned out all of the old crop, you roll down the sides and hope for sunny days and let the temperature get real hot inside. But fallowing for 2 weeks in the fall would be about as good as you can do after having cleaned the old crop out totally. That fallowing in the springtime is not quite as effective because the temperatures don't get that high. Folks who might not have a crop in now, but are going to put one in, if they haven't cleaned, by all means clean. And if you're in Columbia, Missouri, it might get down to 12 below zero. Roll up the sides of your high tunnel and hope it gets cold in there enough to damage the insects. That's the problem, in that high tunnels, even though they're not heated, don't get that cold even on a bone-chilling winter's day, because usually the soil is still relatively warm. So the fallowing is more effective in the fall for a winter crop than it is in the winter for a spring crop. But in both cases, thoroughly cleaning out the previous crop and all of the spent plant material that we possibly can find would be good preventative maintenance.